Every 20th of June, the global community comes together to commemorate or to celebrate international refugee law. We believe that this is inspired by humanitarian international law, but also among other very good practices of respect for human rights, aspects of good conscience, aspects of natural justice, among other very good attributes of human nature. We believe that this is inspired by the need to embrace refugees and see them as equal citizens and, extend the same social services that you would extend to an ordinary citizen. Well, today the Youth Roundtable convenes once again to explore on the aspect of refugee. And this is important because it comes at a time when we know that our borders of Bunagana, that is towards Kisoro, just experienced another refugee spillover from the Democratic Republic of Congo. But also we know that Uganda as a country, our borders are very porous. The insecurity in the region makes us a very, a refugee destination place, if I'm to say. Well, that and much more in the next 1 hour and a half that we shall explore with the Youth Roundtable. And of course, usually, I'm joined by a panel of distinguished. Usually, the number of gentlemen outweigh the number of ladies, but today, the Youth Roundtable is making history. The number of ladies outweigh the number of gentlemen. So I'll just introduce them to you straight away. From my extreme left, which is your right, is now a regular face. Scovia Aweko is the name. She's a PhD scholar of political behavior, but also we know that she has interest around areas of migration. Scovia, many thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you, Kidega, and I'm happy to be here. As Kidega mentioned, I am a PhD student, mainly focusing on attitudes towards refugees in Uganda, but specifically in the West Nile region.
Oh, West Nile region? Okay, I thought you were broad-based. Okay,
the knowledge is generalizable to across the world, actually. Yeah.
All right, many thanks. Next to Scovia is a first time on the Youth Roundtable by the names of Ainembabazi Miracle. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
Ainembabazi works with Pan-African Women Organization. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and she's equally a first timer. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kidega and the viewers. As he has said, my name is Ainembabazi Miracle. I work with Pan-African Women Organization as a researcher, and I'm glad to be at the Youth Roundtable for the first time.
All right, many thanks for joining us. The only gentleman on the show, Mr. Garang.
Yes, sir.
Many thanks for joining us. Kindly say hello to our viewers and introduce yourself. I know you're a leader, but I know there's also much more that our viewers would love to know about you.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
So, my name is Garang Lester is my name. I'm a legal scholar at Nkumba University in Entebbe. I'm also a member of the East African Community Youth Ambassadors Platform for the Republic of South Sudan, and I am glad to be here.
Okay, many thanks for joining us. Next to Garang and to my immediate left as well is a first timer on the show, Prisca. Many thanks for joining us. Prisca, I know that you have, well, I won't spill the beans, but I know that you are an emerging leader, and you have still areas around interest around areas of youth leadership. And if we had to speak about refugees, then we cannot avoid the youth question. So many thanks for joining us. Kindly say hello to our viewers and introduce yourself further.
Okay, thank you so much, Kidega, and thank you so much, all viewers out there. My name is Prisca Akellowanga, an emerging youth leader. I work with the Atangaza Foundation, also work with Debate Society Uganda. It's a pleasure joining you and sharing with the fellow young people. Thank you.
All right, many thanks. To the viewers, we believe that you've heard and you know who the panelists are. So let's cut to the chase. Let's begin the conversation straight away. And Garang, you have the privilege of kicking us off, being the only gentleman on the show. But also, I believe that you're from South Sudan, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have at least a better understanding of the whole refugee experience. So in your own words, to the viewer who has no idea about who a refugee is, what do you have to tell them? What categories make up the refugee population?
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll do the most basic. When you move to the northern part of Uganda, for example, if you go to areas of Adjumani, you go to areas of Arua, if you go to West Nile, And very recently, if you go to the borders of the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a group of people that you will find in camps and then being supported mostly by the UNHCR and other aid organizations and with support from the government of Uganda, specifically the Office of the Prime Minister. And these are people from other parts of Africa and then gathered in small spaces and then they're being served by UNHCR and the government of Uganda and a couple of other organizations. So basically in the context of Uganda, these are the refugees. So if you see such people, for example, those are the refugees. Now in the broader context, a refugee is someone who has left their indigenous place, their home, and then have gone out of that very place to seek asylum, for example, to seek refuge. Maybe they ran away for various reasons. For example, refugees run for political. Most refugees that are in Uganda as we speak, and I also had my share of refuge. I think I spent a couple of years in refugee during my early age, and most of them run from wars, ethnic wars, political wars, and other wars. And then others run for economic reasons. But like I say, the majority of refugees in Uganda are running for political reasons. So sometimes they're escaping wars and these are people seeking security. These are people seeking the most basic of human needs, survival, really. So basically, that is what a refugee is. Yeah.
All right. Many thanks. Scovia, let me come to you. You have interest around migration, and I'm sure that Mr. Lester maybe hasn't covered the whole refugee description, because we know that also the question of asylum seekers, well, they could fall under the political persecution question, but I believe there are many other categories that make up the whole refugee fraternity. So maybe in your own words, maybe additionally to what you have said, what makes up a refugee?
All right, thank you, Kidega, and thank you, Lester, for that introduction into who is considered a refugee. A refugee is someone who is considered to be forcibly displaced. These are people who would, in ordinary circumstances, would not have wanted to leave their homes, but because home is unsafe, home is insecure, they are forced to go and seek refuge somewhere else. And I think in today's world, the idea of who is a refugee has become quite expansive, right? As Lester mentioned, there is a move, a push to actually consider people who are fleeing poverty as refugees as well, because as we know, poverty in itself is a very violent situation, right? Like if someone, right, literally is going days without food, water, cannot afford their basic needs, right? That person themselves needs help. So there is a move to include those kinds of people into the categorization of refugee. But as Lester mentioned, the number one cause of forced displacement is, of course, political violence. And political violence encapsulates a whole lot of things, right? It could be political persecution. In a country like Uganda, we've seen a lot of people actually flee the country because, right, they are being targeted by the regime, by the government. We see a lot of people who are fleeing civil war, be it ethnic conflict or any other type of civil war. We see people who are in other parts of the world who's flee like violence coming from right drug wars. Those are also considered right refugees. But in today's world where we're having a lot of unprecedented extreme weather conditions, we have what we are calling climate refugees. We see in places like Bududa where we have massive landslides that displace a whole lot of people, and although many of the victims in Uganda of those landslides are put in internally displaced people's camps, we see that others might want to seek refuge outside of the country, and those would also be considered refugees because right they've been displaced.
What if they're displaced within the country? Do they also are they still refugees? Or?
No, they're considered internally displaced people. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Miracle, it is only fair that I also give you a chance to tell our viewers your own view about what refugees are, and preferably from the point of view of the Pan-African Women Organization. How do you categorize refugees, and what classes do you look at? What factors do you look at what conditions do you look at to say that, okay, now this falls under our description of a refugee, and therefore we shall extend any sort of social or maybe whatever support you have to extend to them. So how would you categorize your own, refugee cluster?
Thank you so much. Yeah, first and foremost, I'll first take you back to the history of Pan-African Women Organization, because I know most of our viewers and some of us here, it's your first time to hear about it.
Yeah.
It's a women's organization that focuses on women empowerment, gender equality, as well as doing other activities, for instance, patriotism, Pan-African and East African integration. So actually, we look at a wider coverage of things that are affecting the people on the grassroots. Then, for instance, for us as PAO, we mostly look at a refugee as someone who has been displaced, maybe due to political situations like wars. For instance, the one we are now experiencing in Congo and other parts of the and other countries, for instance, Sudan, Somali, and other things. So for us, mostly us being the women, and the fact that the organization was formed when there was a political quagmire, is it okay? Yeah, so we mainly focus on helping women who are the less privileged or helpless, especially during the war. So we focus on women, people with disabilities, and children. Those are people who usually face a lot of problems during the war. So for instance, here in Uganda, we're also focusing on people on grassroots. For instance, on Saturday, for us, we celebrated the International Refugee Day 2 days before it. That was 18th, this Saturday, whereby
the party came early.
Yes, whereby we focused on people, for instance, within Kampala, these women in Kisenyi, Kabalagala, and other parts of Kampala who were struggling. So we gave them some handouts like food and other things to use in their families, plus the words of comfort. So basically, that's my view about
maybe
it.
we shall explore your approach towards the support you give, because you just said handouts, and how sustainable are those handouts?
I can
Should you
actually
be skilling them? Shouldn't you be maybe giving them hands-on skills so they can live on their own?
actually,
I think we'll explore that maybe slightly later on.
it's all
okay.
right.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Prisca, let me come to you. Charity, explores the women angle, okay?
Yeah.
But also we know that among the less privileged or the affected groups of people are also the youth,
Yeah.
As an emerging youth leader, what do you think should be the description? What basket do you think should contain the description of a refugee? Should we have asylum seekers also being part of them? I mean, what category, in your own view, as a young leader or as a young person, do you think the world should move towards?
So
any gaps in the definition of refugee by maybe international institutions?
So yeah, thank you again. So first of all, as a young person, I don't think I differ so much from what they have said in referring to who a refugee is. I think in these categories of people that come to seek for probably they're running away from political instabilities or security instabilities in their different countries or even within. It's not, I don't think it's any different from what young people face or the older people. But also we've realized that most refugees that Uganda or any other African countries have, like, you find that the biggest population is young people. So what then are other young people? What is the approach in helping them, or what is the approach in probably what are the policies that govern or advocate for the rights of the refugees or young people who are refugees? But still, we don't differ so much. I feel then the question is, what are we doing? What are the policies we're advocating for? Because when you look at the Constitution of Uganda, the 1995, which says that refugees have the right to get, like, to reside in an on-sent camping where they can work, they have a right to work and earn a living.
Yeah.
But also we see that there is a lot of stigmatization in communities which has not been addressed towards refugees. I feel then we need to shift to what needs to be done. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Garang, let me come to you. The government of Uganda prides in saying that they run an open door policy. And I think this has been witnessed in how hospitable the government of Uganda is with refugees. If you're to go to Kisoro right now, majority of the land area in that place is actually being occupied by refugees. So I think that the government of Uganda has not only had lip service in terms of saying that our policy is open door, but also I think that there is no better person to explain to us on this panel than yourself, because you've been faced with this kind of maybe open door policy that the government of Uganda prides about. So do you agree that the government of Uganda or Uganda as a country operates an open door policy? But also, what was your own experience coming into Uganda? Did you feel welcomed? Did you feel stigmatized, as Prisca was trying to say? Did you feel that, wow, this is actually an open door policy? You come here, you're embraced by the government, and the people also embrace you, and you fit into the community easily. So what is your own experience, but also a comment around our policy as a country?
Okay, thank you. So I think I, to a very large extent, agree that Uganda has an open inlet or open door policy towards refugees. The first time I was a refugee in Uganda was around 2005. I was really young. I only recall sketchy bits of that memory.
Okay.
But because of what I recall, I don't recall anything really tragic. That a kid will always remember that, okay, I got this because I was a refugee or something of the sort. So it is true that the policy is a good one, open, because an open policy is a policy that's free from restrictions.
Yeah.
Ideally, that there are some restrictions that countries place on numbers of refugees to come in, and then qualifications of who becomes a refugee. I mean, you have to qualify yourself to an extent that makes it look like you chose to move out of your country.
Yeah.
I think in the context of Uganda, we don't have those things.
Yeah.
And also in terms of what Prisca said and how hospitable Uganda is and the stigma attached to that, I think it is a bit context based, because I don't think it is every refugee that faces the same stigma, because stigma then would stem from how you're treated from arrival to the places where you're placed, and then to how you're received by the people. And in reception, there are two categories: the people that you're placed within, that is the local communities that host the refugees. We call them the host communities.
Yeah.
And then the officials, the people that actually receive you, document you, and then walk you through the process of getting established. Well, the reception of the local community or the host community cannot be interpreted to be that of Uganda. And that I say it out of experience. While the community that we stay with can have bits of reservations on the refugees, because this is just human, that someone is strange, you will have reservations on how you deal with them. And that also has a bearing on how refugees in of themselves then placed and act within that local community. So if for some weird reasons they become hostile, that can be interpreted because of the situation within which refugees have placed themselves. And like I said, that cannot be interpreted as a policy by the government of Uganda or Uganda as a country. So I would disagree respectfully that the stigma is a bit maybe context based, and the hospitality is really great. But that doesn't mean that there are no rooms for improvement. Because also when in the places where refugees are placed and the communities, I feel that the little friction that we get from the local communities it's something that can actually be done by a government policy of sensitizing the local community on how they receive the refugees, and then to a greater extent really they stay is good, and the inlet policy is good, and I think and I think since I came to Uganda, because as I speak I'm no longer a refugee, but I came as a refugee, and then but since then there are things that I've got to know about Uganda that are very, very interesting, that the mirror of a refugee can be used to reflect what Uganda as a country would be. And as a country itself, Uganda can look at how it deals with refugees to reflect on its own self. And that is a discussion we can always have,
Yeah.
but that also it's a very important thing. Yeah.
Maybe just a comment on access to social services,
Yeah.
access to healthcare, access to education. Any restriction, any limitation, nothing at all.
Well, education of refugees and education and health services of refugees are strangely not provided by the government of Uganda most times. Most times they are provided by other aid organizations.
Okay, just hold it right there,
Yes.
because you're going into an area that I wanted
Okay.
Scovia to explore,
Okay, yeah.
which is precisely, Scovia, the role of international and also community-based organizations. And that, truth be told, they play an essential role, yeah? But also, how then do we draw the line between the role of government versus the role of international players and also these community-based organizations? So do we have to foster a parallel sort of working model where the government of Uganda is doing what they have to do, but also the international community is doing what they have to do, but also the community-based organizations are playing their part? So which approach for us, but also how do we distinguish, the line between everyone's role?
Okay, I'm about to go on like a long rant, so please stop me if I've taken a whole lot of time.
Sure, you have the time.
Before we even get into those nitty-gritty details, we have to first remember that Uganda is like the first country of entrance for a lot of refugees, and our refugee policy is actually contingent on the fact that once the reason that caused the displacement is dealt with, these refugees will be able to go back, right? And secondly, if there is a protracted stay for most refugees, then they will be resettled into a second or third country. And because of those reasons, Uganda doesn't really focus on integration of refugees within the community. We see that with, what Prisca kind of hinted on earlier, what needs to be done. First and foremost, most of our refugee settlements, we don't call them camps anymore. Most of our refugee settlements are in rural areas. And we have this idea of, refugees are supposed to be self-reliant. They can, on paper, they can technically go out and get jobs. But how are you going to get jobs if you're in a place that already has limited opportunities? And those who actually venture out of those settlements into places like Kampala then lose the provisions that they don't lose their refugee status, but they lose the provisions that they would have gotten in if they were in the settlements, right? And then the role of the government versus international organizations, international governments, we see that in a lot of ways, the governments that support our refugee policies are in of themselves kind of trying to run away from their own refugee or migrant problem. And one of those reasons is that they don't want to deal with the refugee problem, and therefore they offshore that responsibility to countries like Uganda that are willing to take and support those refugees. And that is where we have, every single, if you go and look for Uganda's refugee policy online, you find lots of articles actually praising us for our open door policies, but they don't really consider some of the things that happen, when it comes to refugee governance in Uganda. We see that, the Office of the Prime Minister is in charge of refugee affairs, but this is the same ministry that, this is the same office that pretty much swindles money or aid that is meant for refugees. And the fact that the government knows that it can rely on international donations, international governments to support its refugee policies, we've kind of taken a backseat of let's watch and see what's going on. And then kind of going further into the role of government, we see that in a lot of ways, the government does very little to sensitize the host communities about the presence of refugees in their communities. We see that a lot of people will tell you that, we just wake up one day and there is buses, bringing in refugees. There is no prior warning. And therefore, the communities have very little input on the people that they're, not that they should have a say on the people, but how they should basically structure their relationship. And that's where we get the sort of hostilities that we're talking about, because you bring in these new entrants and it's not just one or two people, it's a usually hundreds, thousands, and all of a sudden you're expected to relate
Yeah.
to them. And so that shock to the system kind of causes this sort of hostilities that we see today. When it comes to stigma, I wanted to respond to something that Lester said. When it comes to stigma, I see that in the research that I've done in talking to a lot of people, even the label of refugee, of course, like labeling someone a refugee was meant to be that, to signal that these are people in need and we ought to help them. But in a lot of ways, in the Ugandan context, we see that it creates a hierarchy, right? So
a social class?
Yes, right. Ugandans start, like, because you're labeled a refugee, you'll be undermined, you'll be considered like, oh, I'm better than you because I'm a citizen and you're a refugee and you don't have the same rights as me, type of thing. And that causes, right, that can also bring in some of the hostilities that we see. Yeah.
Okay, wow, quite elaborate. Miracle, let me come to you. The issue still around women. If you're to look at the Geneva Convention that described or told us that what are the rules of engagement during war, you find that because of such mitigations, the biggest victims or the biggest collateral damage of any insecurity situation are the women, because it is them who cannot fight, therefore they end up just running away. So you'll find that in most of these refugee settlements, the biggest population are actually women and children, right? But then the question still lingers around their access to the unique services that they need, access to maternal health, access to HR, access to all these unique needs that women have because of their nature. So what gaps have power, what gaps have power been able to identify regarding the women refugee population, but also what are you doing exactly to address these gaps?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, once again, what I'll first and foremost thank the government of Uganda for that open door policy, whereby everyone, all refugees can enter and move out at any specific point. Then also the people, the citizens of Uganda, for the generosity and solidarity to welcome in the refugees, as well as the inclusive policies, whereby once you go around in the hospitals, you will find the refugees accessing the same health care that we access, whether in any hospital, whether government or private, as long as maybe they have insurance card or the money to access the healthy. But then we won't say that there are no loopholes. For instance, you find, yes, the government has tried, and NGOs, CBOs, to provide education to the refugees, but it is not quality. They lack quality education. You find there is like 2,000, let me say 200 pupils in one class taught by one teacher or two, which is not the standard of someone to be proud that you are acquiring quality education. Because at the end of it all, they also have to join the labor market and look for jobs. And as well, for instance, women, some refugees came with, for instance, a family of 10 people, 11, 12. And the fact that they don't have access to adequate land to do farming, agriculture, to help them to provide for their families, you find them, some of them have opted to do prostitution, to rape, gang raping as a way of survival. For instance, like in Bidi refugee settlement, I saw a story on World Vision where a lady was just giving sex so that for survival, which is very bad. So for us as Pan-African Women Organization, we have come to see how we can pattern with the Prime Minister's office so that we can help the refugees. For instance, we recently had signed a memorandum of understanding with the Prime Minister's office to see how we can intervene in the refugee issues, as well as we're also partnering with Goodness Happy Association. Those are donors from Malaysia, to come and see how they can intervene, and we work with them so that we provide for the refugees. For instance, we are going to give out tons of food to the refugees as Pan-African Women Organization, but that is just a fish. But we also want to help the refugees to fish themselves, whereby we want to partner with the government of Uganda to give us land. Then we get seeds, we give them to the refugees and encourage them to do farming. So that means after after 2 seasons, I think that they will manage to sustain themselves and go through the hunger and drought and other issues that are affecting the refugees.
Wow. Glad to know that you are not doing mere lip service. You're actually going an extra mile to address some of these gaps. And I think kudos to POW, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Prisca, let me come to you. One part of the conversation that I'm seeing us avoid is the issue around resources, right? And Lester, I'm sure in your constitutional history, you appreciate that one of the biggest causes of conflict in society is around distribution of resources, but also around who is in charge of distributing these resources. Now, truth be told is that when refugee communities come into Uganda, they are going to encroach on the resources that are already limited. Because let's have a honest conversation around this. You know, let us not over-sugarcoat. Yeah, the issue around conflict usually will emerge in these refugee communities around distribution of resources. Either the host community will feel as if, but these guys are here, they're taking our land, they're taking our food, taking our ABCD, you know. So conflict is bound to rise, yeah? But now, the question that I would pose to you is that what conflict resolution mechanisms do you think that any government should champion? Do you think that we should go the Lester way, where he said that we must sensitize communities? That yes, you are going to expect friends from DRC Congo. The only difference is that they are on the other side of the border, but they are one people. Yeah. Okay, so when they come here, don't see them exactly as refugees, but I mean, they're your comrades. So what approach? Is it entirely about the sensitization of the host community, or it's about creating more resource envelopes, you know, creating more resource avenues? Because when these refugees come, they are going to need employment. They are going to struggle for the partition of the resources. Yeah. So how do you go about with the conflict that could emerge from this resource distribution?
Yeah, so first of all, the conversation today is also around security. But yeah, to answer you, first of all, I think we must agree that we don't have enough resources also as a country, because we have seen that even people that are not refugees still don't have access to basic resources. But yeah, first of all, I think the sensitization bit is quite a mechanism that can work, and that will either go both ways, both the host communities and also the refugees that these communities are hosting. And also, I feel some refugees come in Uganda, and they already have, should I say, they're already traumatized by what the kind of communities they're coming from. So you find that even when they leave that setting where that is already traumatizing them, you won't tell me that come and feel at home there and then in Uganda. Yeah. They still have this trauma of, could be these people are like whatever that is coming, whatever that is happening to them the other side could be happening here. They're not sure. So now I feel what needs to be done besides sensitization, we also need to have rehabilitation, probably mechanisms of, first of all, helping these refugees get to settle in and get comfortable with the setting. Then we can look at also sensitizing them to work. Some refugees will reach in a country and be like, I cannot work, this is not my country. Chances are high that I'll not, like, I cannot probably invest in farming, I cannot invest in a business or something. This is not my home country. So they limit themselves to doing certain things. They only want quick, like I would say quick, they would want something real quick. I want to go and work and get paid probably even before the month ends, because I might leave this place anytime soon, because we have an open door policy. So so many refugees might limit themselves to not working, like to not like sitting in with the system, with what the community is trying to put them, the setting they're trying to put them in. So I feel sensitization and also maybe rehabilitation. To make them feel at home, to make them understand that you can be here, you can do this, you can learn hands-on skills, you can invest in case they are already, I mean, they are being economically empowered, they can get money, they can still invest as normal citizens of the country. So I feel the approach of sensitization is pretty much one that the government needs to approach in order to make these refugees feel at home and also fit in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Scovia, I saw your hand is up.
Yes.
Because I wanted to bring in Lester, but I see your hand is up, which is okay.
Yeah, I think there are two parts to this, right? One of the causes of the conflict between refugees and their hosts is that of resource resentment. We see a lot of people, when you talk to them about how they feel about refugees in their communities, they'll tell you, yeah, we are as poor as the refugees, but when the World Food Program trucks and the UN trucks come in to bring provisions, they only go to the refugee camps and we don't get anything.
Yeah.
But on the other, and also like some of the provisions that the government gives them, gives refugees land and things like that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think we have to acknowledge some of the benefits that having refugee settlements in your district brings to you. For example, there are studies showing that where you find refugee settlements, that's where you actually see economic development, right? Especially in those rural areas, we see refugees actually setting up businesses and improving the overall basically the economic outlook of a place, because of they're not only bringing businesses, but they're also customers in a sense. And so when we focus on that sort of resource resentment, they're coming to take away from us, we forget that we as hosts are also benefiting from the presence of refugees in our communities.
I think that's where we do a cost-benefit analysis. the benefits that we get versus how much we are investing in.
Actually, employment opportunities.
But also, I think also with the international communities that are organizations that come in to help, I also think they have some bit of limitations, like because you are dealing with a community that already is marginalized, and also these refugees are also people that are marginalized. So isn't there a mechanism of trying to weigh what they need to do with the communities and also the refugees?
The current policy is that it's a 70-30 approach. The provisions or whatever the benefits that they give refugees, 70% goes to the refugees and 30% goes to the community. Yeah.
All right, Garang, any comments?
Yes,
on this ongoing conversation before we take a short break?
The resource conversation, you mean?
Yes, the resource conversation.
Yes, I wanted to also first begin with you see the responsibility of refugees is not so much of a government responsibility, because the contribution of the government of Uganda to refugees is hosting and making sure that whatever help that comes in the names of refugees actually reaches the refugees. And the security provision for those refugees. Those are basically the responsibilities of the government or any host government. But the responsibility relates to resources. It's a thing that you will grapple to argue as a responsibility of government of Uganda. Because like Prisca already underscored, the government already has a burden. Its own people, the 40-something million Ugandans being fed with a tiny budget, are already a burden to the government of Uganda. So if it was the responsibility of the government of Uganda to provide services and other things to refugees, probably the policy would not be an open door one. So, but that said, so who then does the responsibility of providing for the refugees fall on? The international aid organizations and the global refugee community or the global aid industry. And that is where the conversation then gets a bit wider. Because when the conversation gets to that wide, then the questions of, okay, to what extent or how much is in the coffers for the refugees then starts to come up. And if you look at organizations like the United Nations refugee agencies or UNHCR, it's not a lot that is within the resource banks to then provide for refugees globally or wherever they have decided to host them. Because the process of hosting refugees is an agreement between the organizations and the governments, like government of Uganda. So if that is the case, then that means it's like, host for me my people, I'll feed them, but you protect them, provide them with land that is secure, better than wherever they have come from. So if you promise to feed the people and you can't feed them, then we start to ask, whose responsibility is it? We know whose responsibility it is. Then we start to ask, why are they not being fed? And then the conversation gets wider now.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure if it gets that wide, then the bigger picture is, what should we be doing? Should we be feeding refugees, or should we probably, as a global community, start to address the reasons why people in the very first place become refugees?
Let us begin from there.
Yeah, sure.
After the break, right?
Yeah.
Well, to the viewers, I'm enjoying this conversation. I just hope you are enjoying it as much as I am. But just to remind you, put your comments on the comment section. If you agree with Prisca, with Lester, or any of the panelists, let us know on the comment section. But also, if you disagree, what is your alternative opinion regarding a given subject matter? From us to you, let's take a short commercial break. Just don't blink, because, my friend, you blink, you miss out. See you shortly after the break.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create, and publish digital media, or to access and use computers, other electronic devices, and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
Yes, friends of the Youth Roundtable, thank you for staying with us for this second half of the conversation. We hope that you are enjoying it. Well, this particular segment will focus more on long-lasting solutions. But even before we explore the solutions, we must unpack the root cause of this refugee question. We believe that if we can unpack the root cause of this refugee question, then therefore we can maybe attempt at finding long-lasting solutions. Well, before the break, Mr. Lester was still trying to explain to us the issue of resource distribution. But Lester, as you complete that argument, I want you to explore for us one very important thing, which is how do we distinguish between forced migration and voluntary migration? Because there is a forced migration whereby there is insecurity in your country and you have no option but to move. But there are people who leave the country voluntarily. Maybe they go to find maybe jobs or whatever it is. Then they end up getting stuck in that destination countries and therefore end up being categorized as refugees. So just distinguish for us those two things. Then you also make a conclusion on your argument on resources. Then shall pick it up from there.
So I will begin with the conclusion on the argument on resources. You see, while the global community prides itself as a humanitarian community, I believe that the contribution of the tangible contribution to that humanitarian needs are a bit slow and small compared to the needs of the people that actually need them. Because globally, if we are talking about over 80% refugees, and then the contribution to support them is little, as you hear the UN organizations crying out for support every other year, every other day that passes, and food ratios and other ratios is reducing drastically in refugee settlement areas and all that. So the only thing you can see is that the resources are reducing and the people are increasing. So that means there are no resources to keep feeding people that have been rendered refugees. That is one. Two, so then as we move to then provide solutions, then part of the solution provision should start from maybe tying the tap and not necessarily mopping the water.
Okay.
Then on people and how people become refugees, it is true that sometimes someone leaves their country voluntarily because they just feel they can afford to get out of their country and maybe get a better life or in hopes of a better life, and then they become refugees. But these people are very distinctly different from the people that are actually forced. because forced refuge is sometimes more traumatic, like the ladies have already said. Sometimes you come with the trauma, you have seen people being shot around you, and you're actually winning races with bullets to get your life to safety. Such a person is the one that is actually being forced to leave their country. Give it a chance to stay, they would actually stay and make themselves better. On the other hand, someone who just feels like it's better in Uganda or in Kenya to the work environment is better, or okay, I just feel like I should be around cold places. Such a person, I am very hesitant in calling them refugees, regardless of how they become. Because to come to Uganda, if you're not a refugee, you have to go through the process of immigration. You have to acquire a visa, and you have to be legally documented, and you even have to give reasons why you're coming to Uganda. Have you come as a tourist? Have you come to work? If you have come to work, you acquire a work permit and work. If you have come to tour, you have a specific period of time you're supposed to be in the country. When your tour ends, you're expected to go back, and if you want to stay, you renew your visa and stay. So if you come as a voluntary person, you go through the process of documentation, immigration, and all that, and then for some reasons you can't afford to go back, and then you become whatever you become within the country. Like I said, I am very hesitant in calling such a person a refugee. And the people that we should be calling refugees are the people who actually have less options of living. And it can also come with the political refugees. So that means if you are threatened, you receive messages every other day that your life is in danger because you said a thing or two about the government, and that becomes the reason why you leave your country. That is also forceful refugee. You become a refugee by force, even if you have not necessarily won races with bullets. So those people are the people we should pay attention to, because they are the vast majority and they are the most needy people. While an individual who really just feels they want to move out of their country, whatever becomes of them, radical as it sounds, is their responsibility.
It's a luxury.
Yeah.
Scovia, I was actually coming to you. Yeah, so just hold it right there. If I'm to summarize what he's trying to say is that rather than mopping the water, let's close the tap, right?
Yeah.
So, and the elephant in the room in this conversation is around security. And that is the biggest cause of the refugee population.
Yeah.
Issues around insecurity in their domestic countries. So, in your own view, where does the answer to the aspect of security lie? Does it lie in the federation of, for example, East Africa? Is it a strategic need for us to say, okay, we are going to come up with the East African Federation and we should have as many member states as possible? Because I was listening to the chairman of the East African Federation, the President Uhuru Kenyatta, and he was saying that they are going to deploy the East African Regional Reserve Force, which has membership of Comoros and other African countries. So where does the question around security, so the solution around domestic security lie? Because there's a question of sovereignty, right? The principle of sovereignty, that there is no way, because even if Uganda would love to pacify, for example, DRC Congo or pacify South Sudan, the principle of sovereignty creates limitations that we cannot just walk into DRC Congo and begin to flash out rebels. We must seek the approval of the DRC Congo government. So the question around sovereignty, but also how do you go about with this issue? How do we support member states in stabilizing their domestic countries' security statuses?
Right.
How do you go about it?
So I think in many cases when violence breaks out in a certain country or a certain part of a country, it means that there is weakness, there's state weakness, right? Or the state is incapacitated in a way to actually provide security for people. We see that a lot in, for example, in the Ugandan case, we've had multiple waves of violence in the country, but particularly in northern Uganda, where, right, we see that the presence of the state in itself was very weak. Yes, we had a lot of military involvement or, right, like security involvement there, but we didn't have a lot of like state institutions there to guarantee the well-being of, right, the people. And so when, as I mentioned earlier, when war breaks out, it means that there is some weakness and the government is incapable or unable to provide security. And so entering a community like the East African community means that you do have, right, like a sort of brotherhood, right? Like we look out for each other when trouble breaks out in Uganda, right? Like the Ugandan government can then be honest with itself and say, we don't have the capacity, and therefore we're going to invite these other security forces coming from other countries. And that's why right now we have a lot of arguments, actually, right? The DRC government has an argument with the Ugandan government, and that's why we currently have Operation Shuja in the DRC. And so usually these sort of involvements in securing another country is through invitation, but that invitation is after the government actually recognizes that it is unable to handle the affairs of its own country. And when
do you think any government is going to say that we have failed? Do you think any government in its right senses is going to throw the towel in the ring and say that, you know what, we have failed to handle our own security?
It is not about failure per se, but they will kind of, I guess, mask it in a way, right? To, when they are seeking help. Of course, I'm not saying that the DRC government or even that the Ugandan government during the times of conflict completely failed, right? We saw that there was the presence of the UPDF in northern Uganda. Even in the DRC right now, we see that the DRC security apparatuses, whatever the word is, are right, kind of involved, but at the same time, right, they need that extra bit of help to kind of secure their country. The other thing, right, when it comes to conflict, especially if you are in an integrated society like the East African community is, right, like we are saying that if you're a citizen of a member state, then you have the freedom to move, right, in whatever East African country, right? But then here we are talking about refugees, right? Who are, all the refugees coming into Uganda are from members of the East African community. And yet we're talking about issues of integration, free movement, right? There is that mismatch of, right, the law implementation and practices around that.
Okay, I'll pick on Lester's mind regarding the legal framework slightly later on. But for now, let me bring in Miracle. Miracle, statistics have it that the largest number of these refugees who come into whichever country it is are largely below the age of 18, so meaning they need education, you know, and I think their fundamental right and fundamental need at that point in time could be maybe education, right? Not exactly employment, but education, I think, would stand tall as a fundamental need to these refugees. So speak about the aspect of access to education, both, yes, we know that Uganda has the universal primary education and the universal secondary education,
which is not implemented.
Yeah, well, the issue around its implementation can be discussed, but at least there is that free education. So are refugees also benefiting from this free education? Because if they are, then the aspect of access to education is actually addressed. So in your experience as PAO, in your day-to-day engagements with these women, are they actually having free access to education? Or it remains a myth?
It's a myth.
Thank you for that question. What I can say, actually, for last PAO, we have just started serious involvement with the refugees. So, for instance, what we have been doing, which can relate to access to education or to sensitization, we have been opening up Pan-African clubs in all schools and universities around Uganda, which means, for instance, and in some of those schools, especially universities, we have international students, those from Sudan, Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo. So once we instill those values of Pan-Africanism, patriotism in the young generation, it means we as East African community and Africa as a whole, we are winning. For instance, teaching someone the values of loving themselves, loving the country, working hard to see the country progress. That is the biggest achievement. Because we have kadogos. We see these kadogos were the young kids, young pupils and students in schools. So it means they didn't have that sense of patriotism and Pan-Africanism, the need for integration, free market, free education, the need for a stable political environment that favor everyone to access their needs and access services as well. Then relating to what you have asked me directly, I can say, education. Yeah, actually we are looking much to focus on education sector. For instance, the idea I was talking about of agriculture, it means if a parent grows maize and the maize is ready, and after harvesting the maize, it means the parent can afford to get money to pay the school fees for the children or the relatives. In that sense, the children will be accessing quality education. And as well, the government of Uganda has worked heavily to make sure that the refugees can access good education. Plus other NGOs, for instance, MasterCard Foundation, it's favoring much on refugees, World Vision. And I know that can't be done without the hand of the government. And plus even power sensitization campaigns to make sure that even like there is actually a difference between quality education and the willingness to go and acquire it, because that all starts with sensitization. I think now the government, we saw in the budget, there is that money that is going to cater for mindset change. I wish they can extend it to refugees as well, since there is
it's
also
about the parish development model or something. Yeah, the mindset change.
Yeah, so they would have at least diverted some to help our
Power,
brothers and sisters, power, so that we get involved in such big programs.
Good way to look at it. Yeah. So that's all?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Prisca, I see your hand is up, but also I have a question for you. During the break, one of you made a comment, and I will not mention the name of the person, but one of you spoke about the burden, that who should carry the burden. That you have conflict in your country, and because you're a weak state and you're a weak government, you've caused insecurity and therefore a refugee spillover. So the question of burden, who should bear the burden to really meet the costs, right? And I think that's why the aspect of negotiation comes in. That, okay, yes, we are going to host your refugees, your people from maybe DRC Congo or South Sudan, but how can we negotiate to say that, yes, we shall host them, but per refugee that we are going to host, we are going to ask you to make a contribution of this amount of money. Do you feel that is a way we can look at it, or that undermines the spirit of Ubuntu, that undermines the spirit of comradeship, undermines the aspirations of the federation? Yes, because then the idea of a federation is that you stand with me in my difficult times, but also in my good days. So if I'm having a difficult time and we have insecurity and my friends and my people are around your country, why then should you ask me for money to look after them? So do you think that that would undermine the spirit of Ubuntu and spirit of the federation? Or do you think that it is about taking responsibility, that if you do something, you must be able to, pay for it? So which way do we go?
So yeah, if only East Africa embraced integration, I think we wouldn't have a discussion of refugees. But yeah, nonetheless, that's something that has not been done. So we have to have the discussion of who then takes the burden. I think, first of all, we're not saying that we don't want to. I don't think any sane person or any sane government would refuse to like give relief to people that truly need it. I think now the question is, do they even have the capacity? That's the question. We're not undermining the spirit of Ubuntu, but I think we don't have the resources. That's why you find that even these refugees in their different camps still have a lot of basic things that they lack. I think the burden should be shared. That for me, I think the burden should be shared. Okay. We are hosting let's say Kenya is hosting refugees from South Sudan or from Congo, or Uganda is hosting them. Even Uganda, the fact that they cannot give the bare minimum to their citizens, I don't think they can help with the refugees. But if only those governments, let's say there is a political instability in Congo, and Congo has resources that they can give to their people in Uganda, where Uganda is hosting them. Because we know Congo is a rich country, they have resources that may not be like financial, like they don't have, but they have resources that they can exchange for financial benefits. So that's
they should give us some gold and timber.
Exactly. Then there should be a shared burden for those that are hosting, but also those that those citizens belong to already, like domestically they belong to that thing. But also, I have a comment about the education.
Okay.
I feel I don't think we need to have a discussion of the free education in Uganda. I personally would say I went to my primary. I went to a school that claims to have free education, that the government says they have it instilled in that particular school. But I paid tuition all through, and also we see that I got a chance of interacting with some schools in places that are dominantly filled with refugees. I don't know whether you know Kiriandongo.
Yes,
It's a place that is mostly dominant with refugees, and students in that community pay tuition that is even higher than because they have like international students and the citizens. You don't pay the same amount, but also this is something that we have seen in several schools. So the education, the government, I feel, well, whereas they feel there is something they're doing, I don't think it's being done. I don't think we need to have a conversation about the free education, which is not there even for citizens of Uganda. So for me,
maybe
I won't deny the fact that something is being done by the government, because by the fact that they are hosting the refugees, that is also not something small that some countries have actually failed to do. But also I feel there are gaps that we need to bridge, especially with the education system, because most refugees are young. They need to be educated for them to go to that mindset change that they want to. So for me, I think with the cassava economy that we have, the government cannot lift the burden entirely on them. There should be a shared thank you.
Okay, a shared burden, a shared responsibility. All right, fair enough. Lester, back to you. Uganda and many other African states are moving towards a modern state kind of setting, right? Where we have respect for international law, we have respect for human rights, among these other very important aspects. So someone would argue and say that part of this hospitality that we see countries like Uganda demonstrating is because they are bound by international humanitarian law. So the question then to you is that, expand for us the legal framework. Is Uganda actually bound? Are we duty bound to host refugees? Is there any law that puts us under obligation? You know, because for example, I know that, for example, airports, that Uganda has no mandate to stop a plane from landing on our airport. That is an international convention, right? So now, the aspect of refugees, are there any strictly stipulated laws, both internationally and domestically, that make governments bound to be hospitable to humanitarian needs and things like that?
Yes, the short answer is yes. And the long one, I want to start the long one with this. That in the context of Africa and Uganda as a country within the framework of the same suffering that we go through as African people, I wouldn't argue that Uganda does what it does because it's bound by international law.
Okay.
So while it's true that Uganda is bound, because Uganda is a signatory to the Geneva Convention, the Uganda is also a signatory to the Organization of African Union Convention on the Maputo Protocol and all these other things. And even within Ugandan legal framework, Uganda enacted a whole Refugee Act of 2006. So that means there is a legal framework that binds Uganda, or that bounds Uganda to treat refugees as it does. But even if that did not exist, it is just not logical that if people came running from gunshots, you would actually deny them entry. Those are things that countries like America does, because you see them building walls and and countries like Germany, for example, or some EU countries. Those are things that people do that side of the world, where you see people arriving in water and then you want to shoot them back into water.
Just like during the Russia-Ukraine issue.
Exactly.
The Poland.
Exactly. The Poland question.
The people who are actually sleeping outside.
Exactly. People are denied entry. Those are things that we don't do in this part of the world. So even if there was no legal framework, Uganda would not do what Poland were doing, or what other countries were doing, or what America did when they built the wall. So that said, the legal framework binds Uganda, and Uganda simply makes it formal, the formality that Uganda will have to do something like that. So that doesn't mean if Uganda does not do it, someone would sue Uganda at the end of the day. Then also, in Uganda, if you look at what the law provides, because if you read at Section 29 of the Refugee Act, the same entitlements and obligations of refugees would adjust the opposite of what a citizen of Uganda would have. So it's just another way of formalizing what a refugee can feel entitled to. It's a legal way of saying you are entitled to the same thing as a Ugandan would be entitled to, because you can actually own property, you can transfer property that you owned before you went into Uganda, and you still own it. You can participate in economic activities. You can pay taxes if you want to. You are entitled to an identity card.
Taxes
they're not
is optional.
Because some refugees run businesses around. So
paying taxes,
by running a business, you have to pay taxes.
Exactly. So paying taxes comes with earning a profit.
But is it mandatory?
It is a mandate for those who make money.
Yes, those who make money.
If you have a kiosk, you cannot be left from collections of city council because you are a refugee. Definitely not. You're running a business. You're making profits. So you pay taxes. If you don't have a business, you can't be required, even if you are Ugandan. I mean, what are you taxed in? So it's the same thing, really. It's really the same thing. So, but the point I'm trying to make is that the same entitlements and rights that Ugandans enjoy, or that accrue to Ugandans by being Ugandans, are just the flip side of the same things that Section 29 of the Refugee Act provides for refugees. So ideally, the framework is concrete. But I just wanted to say something about the idea, because I think this relates to the legal framework, the idea of sovereignty, a conversation we had a couple of minutes ago. It is true that countries are sovereign and they enjoy their sovereign rights. But by the time the things that you do within your own boundaries have an implication on your neighbor, and then sovereignty comes to protect you from responsibility for the same things that you do, we might need to question our policy again. Because you cannot argue sovereignty for a country that has expressly failed to contain its own political situation within its countries. So if possible, and it is very possible, we can then start to explore means of having to fix such countries, especially if we exist in a global space or a regional space like the East African community. The East African community integration should move beyond just an economic integration. It should then become a political integration to an extent that if member countries have political challenges, there should be a metric for them to be fixed without necessarily violating their sovereignty. Yes.
Wow, just amazing. Yeah, Scovia,
Can I say something?
your hand is up. Yes, I won't give that opportunity. But also, I have a question for you. And you did mention this earlier on, the aspect of climate change. I think that we have ignored that, but truth be told is that if there is a flood happening, for example, in Eastern Congo, okay, the population there is going to be forced to leave Eastern Congo and maybe come into Uganda, okay? Look at, I think about 3-4 years ago, there was a drought, there was flooding around the borders of Tanzania. And I'm sure the people who were staying there had to leave that area. So the aspect of climate change, we must address that issue if we are to maybe have a step forward towards addressing the bigger population of refugees. Yes, so speak to the aspect of climate change and try to relate it to refugees, then also your hand was up.
Yeah, one thing that Lester forgot to mention is that signing those conventions and laws is voluntary. Nobody really forces those governments to actually sign onto them and implement them. And on the other hand, you can pretty much leave at any time you decide to, because you are sovereign.
But once you ratify,
but once you've signed and ratified, then clearly you should have read, right?
Yeah.
And also
the stipulations
Uganda
within those
operates on a
conventions.
dualist approach towards
Exactly.
international law, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And
Where
also
the parliament has
the,
to
the ratification
approve before-
process.
Oh yeah, the ratification process
is what
is
led to the
multiple
Refugee
tiered.
Act.
Yeah.
Ideally, yes.
Right, it's
Yes.
multiple tiered, right? But that's the thing, right? Once you've signed and ratified, then you should have read the stipulations within those conventions, and if you're bound by those stipulations, so like if you sign on to something, like we all agree to
The
terms
signature
that,
binds
right?
you.
You know, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, you agree to their terms
Conditions.
and conditions, and so if
Even
you
though we
feel like you
sometimes
can't do
don't
it,
read.
then leave the right,
Leave Facebook,
leave
leave
the site, like
Twitter. Yes.
leave if you feel like, you know, you're being forced to host refugees and you don't want to host refugees.
Yeah.
You can easily leave, but once you have signed and ratified, then you cannot repatriate
Okay.
refugees. You're bound by
Yes.
those laws, because repatriation means, you know, sending someone back to their home country when it is still considered unsafe. And that is what is leading to like the protracted stay of refugees in Uganda. We find that people are in settlements for over 20, 30 years. And because we really have no plans for integration, we leave them. And it's really, really, right, quite disheartening for someone to live their whole lives in a refugee settlement waiting to be resettled or to go back to their home countries. And therefore, that is where we actually have to do better. When it comes to climate change, we see that there are two different types of, I guess, like extreme weather events that leads to displacement, right? On the other hand, we have rainfall flooding, right? And the people who flee or who are displaced as a result of rainfall or flooding are in many cases considered temporary, right? Like once the water subsides, they're able to go back. But in the East African region, we have places that have experienced extreme drought, right? And we have, those are places like Ethiopia, Somalia, people dying of hunger, starvation. And in many cases, right, that is the sort of weather events that we are expecting, right? Not the flooding and landslide, although that is also prominent, but where I think we're prepping up for the dry, prolonged dry seasons. And once a place starts experiencing those prolonged dry seasons, right, we see that it is very, very hard for it to go back to its natural state. And that is where we have to redefine, right, who we consider a refugee. That's where we're starting to consider climate migrants as refugees themselves, because if a place is dry or desertified, then there's no possibility that it can actually sustain life for a really, really long time. People will continue to starve, to die, and all of that. And so going forward, I know that a lot of people don't believe that climate change is a real thing, but we have seen, right, people actually enduring the drastic effects of climate change. And like climate change is not something that's happening, that's going to happen in the future. It is something that is happening now, and therefore we should take measures to actually mitigate those effects. And, you know, something controversial, one of the things that we should mitigate or do in order to mitigate that is stop ECOP, but that is a different thing.
I am not sure if our viewers heard that last word, but maybe we need to emphasize it. Yeah, but yeah, fair enough. I hear you. We are coming to the end of this conversation, but Miracle, are there any benefits that come with refugees? Because I believe there are some, but maybe our viewers need to know what benefits come with actually a host community welcoming and having refugees. Because I'll give you sort of a hypothetical example that majority of the people who fought the NRA war were actually people who had fled the genocide in Rwanda. Yeah, you look at the Gisa regime all that community were actually people who were refugees in Uganda. So many have argued that, you know, from the military point of view, refugees are potential infantry, potential, you know, recruits into the military. But there is the there's the bigger picture of the benefit of that comes, you know, with hosting refugees. So maybe just mention for us one or two of those benefits.
Thank you. Yeah, I think actually refugees come with some benefits. For instance, business. most of the refugees have contributed to the socio-economic development of our country. For instance, if you go to streets, food hubs around, you find Somalis preparing for us food and they are selling with us. And to add on that, they are paying taxes to URA, which is contributing to the development of our country as well. Then also we can look into employment opportunities to our locals. For instance, most of the Ugandans, they are the ones that are working in refugee camps. They are the ones owning NGOs that are helping the refugees to cope up with the conditions that they are living in. So you find it is even the Prime Minister's office. We can find out that most of them are all Ugandans. So that is a big contribution to the economy. But we can't focus on the advantages, and we fail to highlight some of the disadvantages that the refugees bring in our society or our country.
No, I think we have explored more.
We have largely done.
But thank you, Miracle. Prisca, lastly, you could expand on the benefits that come with refugees.
So for me, I think first of all, the role that she mentioned earlier, because I wasn't aware that it's a 70-30 policy. So if the international organizations that aid refugee camps come in, let's say if you look at a community like Boyale, Kiriandongo, you find that it's mostly dominated by refugees, but also it's it's not a marginalized community like it used to be. That means that the contribution of its growth has also been highly come from the fact that what international organizations put in to aid these refugees also goes back to helping the communities that hosting refugees. So to add on what you said, it aids the growth of the economic growth of our country, which we should highly appreciate. But also I feel it also helps in the labor force. You find that certain refugees that come in our country that could be specialists in different fields, let's say doctors, or if you go to different refugee camps, you might find refugees who are highly specialized in a certain field, which helps to also, it helps to aid the workforce in that particular field. Doesn't consume what the government has to put in a lot. So I think that's also something that we should highly, be thankful for. But also I think that expertise sometimes helps to aid the growth of a certain community and all that. So that should something that we should be highly grateful for.
That, and I'm sure much more, right?
Yeah.
All right, comrades, our time is fast spent, but I'll give you each 30 seconds or a minute. Okay, a minute is fair enough, right? To give us your parting words on the show. It could be a recommendation, it could be what you maybe haven't said on the show, but also, how best can we enhance the refugee, protection, their human rights, access to services, among these other things. So I'll begin with Scovia, Miracle, Prisca, and the gentleman will have the last words.
Okay. All right. As members of the East African community, one thing that we should remember is that the refugees that we're hosting, especially in Uganda, are coming from our own member states. And we do have, a stipulation for freedom of movement within the East African community. And based on that, I really do believe that the government should put its efforts in integrating refugees into our communities and economies, and not necessarily keeping people in refugee settlements where they, for pretty much most of their lives, have to depend on donor organizations and the government, for their existence.
All right, thank you. Miracle?
Yeah. I'll conclude by thanking the government of Uganda for creating an enabling environment for refugees to come and settle here in Uganda, and at the same time get privileges that the citizens also get. Then I also thank the UNHCR for also coming in to help our people, our brothers from Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, through providing services. Then also my organization as well, Pan-African Women Organization, headed by the General Secretary, Madam Grace Cavallo, also the chairperson, Honorable Cecilia Oral, for coming out with these strong strategies to make sure that no one is left behind as far as socioeconomic development of our country is concerned, and also our citizens, especially the hosting communities, for also creating a good environment to make the refugees settle in. And also, what I'll end up with about the neighboring countries, especially Congo, I think it's high time that those countries can come to an agreement and see what we as the East African community, the African, the international community can do to make sure that peace is restored in those countries. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Prisca?
my parting shots. It was very nice joining the panel today, but for me, my recommendation is can we shift the conversation of integration from just speaking to our implementation, and also advocating for what the integration instills, or what it speaks for. I think that will we could have refugees that come to the East African community, not to Uganda, from Kenya to Uganda, or from Congo to Uganda. We could have maybe refugees that come from other countries, which I think would be highly, the number wouldn't be that much. That for me would help a lot in also curbing on different problems that come along, or the problems that bring along why do we even have refugees, like political instabilities that can be addressed as the East African community. For me, that the integration should shift from just words and in writing, but to actions. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Lester, you have the last word.
Okay, from globally, from Yemen to Iraq to Iran to Libya, and now to Congo, South Sudan, and several African countries, many of these refugees have, or many of these crises of refugees have come in defense of democracy. Wars have been fought in the name of defending democracy. But in analysis, defense of democracy has created more refugee problem than the lack of democracy. So it is time we started to think again about why we fight wars that result in refugee crisis. Then lastly, yesterday the East African heads of state communicated. Maybe we would ask them to not stop that communication on paper, to then implement the ideas that they shared, so that the problem of refugees and the wars that are ongoing in Congo are settled once and for all, so that we see other problems. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure.
All right, amazing. I can't thank you enough. From Scovia to Miracle to Lester and Prisca, thank you for sparing the time to be on the Youth Roundtable. Of course, to our technical team, Rashid and everyone else, Ronnie, thank you for sparing the time to ensure that our viewers get this show right on time. Well, I can only add my voice to what has already been said, that let us look forward to long-lasting solution as to the causes of this refugee spillover. But otherwise, from the Youth Roundtable, from us to you, we say have a lovely week, have a lovely afternoon, and until next week, same time, see you. Bye-bye.